All right, I think we've got, I see a few more people trickling in, but I think let's go ahead and get started for the sake of time. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and hi, everyone. Welcome. Again, my name is Nicole Goodrich. I am with the USAID Asia Bureau's Senior Democracy and Governance Advisor in our Technical Services Office, and my pronouns are she and her. Thank you for joining us today on this presentation about technology-facilitated gender-based violence in Asia. Before I turn it over to our own Asia Bureau's Acting Assistant Administrator, Karen Friedman, to open this event, I'm going to go over 3 reminders for our time together. First, this presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be shared with everyone shortly following this presentation today. And the final report is expected next February. So February 2022. Can't believe saying 2022, it's not that far away, but just wanted to let you be aware that the final report will be shared with all of you early in the new year. Second, our presenters' bios have been in the event invitation. I say this as we will not have time today for formal introductions, but please do review their biographies when you have a moment if you haven't already. Third, this presentation is 1 hour long, and we will have time for question and answers towards the end. If you have questions as we go along, you're welcome to type them into the Q&A function. That's in the bottom middle of your screen, and you can access that by clicking Q&A. Please use this function for questions rather than the chat so as to avoid distractions for our presenters. If you prefer to verbally ask your question, when we get to the Q&A session, you'll also see a hand sort of at the bottom middle of your screen as well, and you are welcome to raise your hand during that time, and the moderators will call on you. With that, let me turn to Karen Freeman, Acting Assistant Administrator for USAID's Asia Bureau. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to the organizers for this. It's such an important topic for us to be covering, and I'm proud and pleased to be with you and welcome you in whatever time zone you may be coming from. It's really important to engage in this vital discussion about technology-facilitated gender-based violence in Asia. What do we mean when we say technology-based gender-based violence? For our purposes today, we'll define this as actions that cause harm to others based on their sexual or gender identity using the internet or mobile technology, including enforcing harmful gender norms. As many of you know, we're in the midst of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, an annual global campaign that begins on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence and ends on Human Rights Day. During the campaign, USAID joins the broader international community to draw attention to the need to address gender-based violence in all forms. Gender-based violence transcends borders and cultures. It's a global epidemic affecting millions of people each year. Gender-based violence also prevents the full participation of people of all genders in all realms of life, be it civil life, political, and even social engagement, and the ability to earn a living. Access to technology creates tremendous opportunities for learning to help people advance their careers and obtain health and financial services, among many other important gains that we strive for in our development work. Technology-facilitated gender-based violence undermines all of this and has the potential for really setting us back in very, very real ways. We've seen countless headlines, and now we have evidence that gender-based violence has skyrocketed since the beginning of the pandemic, especially across the Asia Pacific. It's become what we call a shadow pandemic, and we need to come together and put an end to it, just as we must stop this virus. It's something that causes us, that emphasizes the importance of us being together here today and understanding what this is, what it means. It is also no secret that online abuse is rampant in our increasingly digital world. And again, the pandemic has only served to make this worse, especially for women and girls who already faced high levels of online abuse because of their gender, even before the pandemic. Lockdowns have brought more people online with greater frequency under intensely stressful conditions, raising the risks of technology-facilitated GBV. Technology-facilitated GBV is the complex yet pressing problem that we want to learn about here today. Given the severity and the pervasiveness of this issue, it's essential that we understand what's really happening so we can determine the best ways to work together to prioritize and tackle this challenge. This type of gender-based violence takes many forms and has real consequences for people, families, and entire communities. USAID, Asia Bureau, and Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center have partnered with NORC at the University of Chicago and the International Center for Research on Women to undertake research that will increase our understanding of this issue in Asia and its relevance to our programming. We really are looking forward to sharing the final report in February of 2022 and putting the recommendations into actions. And so we appreciate your attendance today, and we seek your support in ensuring that we are all effectively working to address, understand, and end technology-facilitated gender-based violence in the work that we do. So with that, I will turn this presentation back over to Laura Hinson, the Senior Social and Behavioral Scientist at ICRW, to share more about the research that we're here to understand. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you all for the work that you're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, for your opening remarks. We really appreciate you setting the stage on this important topic and for providing a valuable USAID perspective. So hello, everyone. Greetings from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us today to discuss this topic. As Karen just said, my name is Laura Henson, and I'm a Senior Social and Behavioral Scientist at the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW. So before I dive into the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge the study team that's behind this work. So from joining me today are my colleagues from ICRW, Polomi Pal, Aaron Leisure, and Connor Roth. And our partners at NORC include Bedihi Bansal, who led the work and was supported by Mayumi Rezwan and Mitala Ayer. So just wanted to introduce the team. So today I'm just going to start with a very quick overview of the topic, the study, and the methodology before I pass it over to Mitala and Palomi, who will be presenting our regional and country-specific findings and recommendations. And then after our formal presentation, which should be maybe around 20-30 minutes, we'll have some time left over for Q&A. So slide. So to start, I wanted to provide us all with a definition, which actually Karen already did in her opening remarks, but I'll read it again because I think it's a little bit of a mouthful. So technology-facilitated GBV is defined as any action carried out using the internet and/or mobile technology that harms others based on their sexual or gender identity or by enforcing harmful gender norms. So there's certainly a growing interest among implementers, policymakers, NGO, and civil society actors on this topic in recent years, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're really excited to share some of our findings on this topic from Asia. So for the purpose of this study and this project, we use the term technology-facilitated GBV or tech-facilitated GBV. We also acknowledge there are many other ways to talk about this. People use online violence, online gender-based violence, cyber violence. There's a lot of different ways people talk about it. Ours is a bit of a mouthful, but we feel like was linguistically sort of the right term to use. So I'm happy to take any questions on that at the end as well. Slide. So this work began with funding from USAID Asia Bureau under the DRG-LER 2 activity. And as Karen said, USAID contracted NORC in partnership with ICRW to conduct this landscape analysis of technology-facilitated GBV in the Asia region. Specifically, the aim of this study was to identify what constitutes technology-facilitated GBV, analyze trends in this form of the violence in the region, assess the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on the issue, as well as some other kind of general topics. And although our original scope included Central Asia and the Pacific Islands, we really didn't find sufficient literature in our review to meaningfully include or interpret. So most of all of our findings and recommendations you'll see really focus predominantly on South and Southeast Asia. So the research team developed priority questions in consultation and collaboration with USAID. And given the paucity of evidence on this nascent topic, the questions were really focused on, descriptive categories like trends, profiles of survivors or victims and perpetrators, the impacts of experiencing this type of violence, and the prevention, mitigation, and response efforts currently being employed in some of these countries and regions by the government, by civil society, et cetera. And the research questions and the study approach was informed by a conceptual model, which I'll share in just a few minutes. Slide. So as part of this study, we conducted two things. First, a literature review, and second, a set of case studies. So for the literature review, in order to capture the breadth and the depth of this topic and this growing body of evidence, we did a comprehensive search of both peer review and gray literature. We analyzed articles published in the last 15 years from the Asia region. The team screened almost 2,000 articles, of which in the end, there were 97 articles that were included and analyzed after multiple rounds of screening. And actually, the graph on the right shows the density of articles from the various countries in the Asia region. And as you can see, the bulk of the articles come from India and Pakistan. And this is not to say that tech-facilitated GBV doesn't exist in these other countries, just that it's not as heavily documented as it is in India and Pakistan and some of the other countries towards the bottom. And for the case studies now, we did it for Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and Thailand. And each case study provides a really in-depth presentation of country-specific trends, along with interviews we did with key stakeholders from government, NGOs, researchers, other GBV experts to really inform our country-specific understanding of what's going on and the existing programs. Slide. So I mentioned earlier that our research was informed by a conceptual framework that was developed by ICRW several years ago. So don't worry, I won't go through each aspect of this framework in painstaking detail, but I did want to present this framework and show you a little bit about the topic, just so we can all be sort of grounded around what we're talking about, what constitutes tech-facilitated GBV. So first in the middle, you'll see that an experience of tech-facilitated GBV begins with some type of relationship, either personal, impersonal, or institutional in nature. Then on the left side of the framework, we have the motivation and intention behind the perpetration. So for example, perpetrators might be motivated by jealousy or an intent to cause psychological harm, or they may be inspired by a misogynistic ideological agenda, an intent to enforce patriarchal norms on a group of women who are misbehaving online. The behaviors, which are kind of in the middle there, these are the actions we tend to think about when we think about gender-based violence, right? So stalking, defamation, sexual harassment, exploitation. Now, these are based in a set of cross-cutting tactics, which is sort of the new technological aspect of this framework. And here, this framework focuses on 6 primary tactics: doxing, hacking, threats, image-based abuse, impersonation, and unwanted messaging or posting. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those means later in the presentation. Now, on the right side of the framework, we have impacts on and help seeking or coping mechanisms of the victims or survivors. So impacts are the things that happen to the person who's experienced the violence, such as depression or dropping out of school. And help seeking behaviors are the actions that person takes or not as a result of their experience, such as shutting down their account, reporting to the police, etc. And of course, my favorite part, there at the bottom, all this is influenced by the social, gender, cultural, religious, political, technological norms and mores of the culture and society in which the violence is happening. Slide. So I will now turn it over to Mitala and Palomi to present the key findings and recommendations from our work.
Great, thanks, Laura. So we want to begin our findings today by first understanding what kinds of behaviors were associated with tech-facilitated gender-based violence in Asia. There are a range of behaviors that fall under this umbrella term, and the ones listed on this slide were commonly reported in the literature across Asia. I'd like to briefly highlight some of these terms, as not everyone might be completely familiar with them. For example, image-based abuse encompasses non-consensual distribution, creation, and dissemination of private or sexual images. Doxing refers to the malicious disclosure of private or identifying information online, such as posting someone's physical home address on social media without their consent. Hacking or using technology to access accounts without permission can be used to commit forms of gender-based violence, such as non-consensual sharing of private images or information. If there are any other terms here or throughout the presentation that we can clarify, please feel free to ask during Q&A. And as you might imagine, there can be overlap amongst these forms of violence. Our findings also indicate that some definitions or standard usages can vary by country or context. Some terms are also used interchangeably while others are not, which in itself is a challenge within the field. Our findings also indicate that there's a relationship between these forms of online violence and offline violence. Online violence can lead to both offline violence or can follow it. For example, in Bangladesh, it has been reported that online harassment of activists or political figures often leads to physical attacks. On the other hand, a study in Thailand found that regions that had higher rates of offline violence also had high cases of technology-facilitated abuse and harassment, despite having relatively lower usage of internet and mobile phones than other regions. Slide, please. Our review of the literature also indicates that across time, the prevalence of technology-facilitated gender-based violence is increasing over time. We found that women, girls, and LGBTQI+ individuals experience tech-facilitated GBV at disproportionately higher rates. Particularly young women are more likely than men to face severe online abuse that is sexualized and different forms of violence. And noting some points about some of the countries we've studied, the expansion of ICT infrastructure and access in Bangladesh has led to an increase in online harassment and abuse. In Indonesia, there's been a particular rise in anti-LGBTQI+ rhetoric in social media. One study found that starting in 2016, there's been an increase of incidences of tech-facilitated violence against these individuals, which has been linked to changes in the political environment and also increased publicity of events in media. In Malaysia, reports of online love scams have been of increasing concern. And this form of deception tends to have exploitative intentions, where scammers befriend and defraud lonely internet users of large sums of money, often under the guise of pursuing a romantic relationship. It's also been reported that most targeted victims were lonely and elderly women. Slide, please. We also found an increase in tech-facilitated GBV reporting during and as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in Asia. For example, in the Philippines, reports show that cases of online sexual abuse were 4 times higher in 2020 than in 2019. During 2020 in Pakistan, calls to digital harassment helplines tripled from before. Further, the majority of these reports were also made by women. In India, we found that analysis of Twitter data revealed that conversations around technology-facilitated GBV on the platform tripled during the period of COVID compared to previously, also indicating that this is a rising concern and topic of conversation. There are several reasons that why we may be seeing this particular increase in technology-facilitated GBV. We find that children are at higher risk as more time online to access education or entertainment during quarantine has led to increased exposure to forms of GBV or online violence, such as cyberbullying, harmful content, or exploitation. Users with limited digital skills who may not have information on best practices to protect themselves online are also at higher risk of cyber abuse and exploitation during COVID. Children whose parents are less technologically savvy are also at particular risk due to weakened parental oversight, advice, and guidance. And finally, it's also been shown that stressors from economic pressures increase the risk of exploitation and of intimate partner violence. For example, it has been reported that economic pressure on families as a result of the pandemic increases the potential for exploitation of girls, including online sexual abuse or trafficking for economic gain. Slide, please. So this ties into several key factors overall that our literature indicates facilitate or incentivize the perpetration of technology-facilitated GBV in Asia. So some common themes of these factors across countries include social norms and taboos, as well as the general technological landscape and ICT environment. Many studies across different countries that we analyzed cited patriarchal norms in societies that influence the kind of this behavior conducted online. For instance, one report from Pakistan highlighted that because patriarchal and religious norms play a strong role in shaping individual identity and behavior online, particularly the preservation of family honor. This could further incentivize perpetration of technology-facilitated GBV against women and vulnerable groups. Gender and class divides that are present in society are also reflected in the digital space. For example, in India, cases have been documented where men from privileged backgrounds, including upper-class Brahmins, receive significant protection from the community after threatening, harassing, and abusing women online. Another facilitator of this issue is that tech-facilitated GBV is normalized in large parts of Asian society. For example, in South Asia, regional films may normalize cyberstalking and provide frameworks for non-consensual relations. And finally, the concept of consent is not well understood, and discussions of sex and sexuality in general is considered taboo or shameful. And in turn, these societal taboos can feed into the idea of reputation damage to the self, family, and community if an individual speaks about experiencing cybersexual harassment or exploitation. In addition to these societal norms, technological factors influence or facilitate this form of violence as well. And as we've mentioned previously, we've seen evidence that those with low digital literacy are more likely to be at risk. This also relates to the gender digital divide, which refers to women and girls' lack of access to use and development of ICT technology. The nature of these digital platforms also affords perpetrators anonymity that offline interactions do not, which lead to lower rates of prosecution and punishment. This also makes it difficult for targets to respond or report to incidents without knowing the true identity of their perpetrator. I will now hand it over to Pulumi to cover some more findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Mithila. In terms of who experienced technology-facilitated GBV in the Asia region, findings are not surprising and reflect global trends. Women and girls face disproportionately high level of violence online. The gender digital divide predisposes women to tech-facilitated violence, as well as underlying societal and gender norms that perpetuate GBV. Individuals with intersectional marginalities, such as low caste status, religious minorities, non-heteronormative gender identities, and low socioeconomic status are more at risk for online harassment and abuse. For example, throughout South Asia, LGBTQI+ individuals are targeted based on their sexual orientation, with transgender women at higher risk than cisgender women. In India, those of Dalit caste and Muslim religion are marginalized more than women of other identities. School-age children and youth are higher risk of cyberbullying and online harassment compared to older social media users. Findings from Thailand show that low parental education, economic status, and family structure contribute to parents being unaware of online risks and unable to protect children from online harassment. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you. In terms of impacts, we organized the findings around impacts on survivors in Asia into three main categories, as you can see. Psychological impacts of tech-facilitated GBV are commonly documented in the literature and include everything from fear and helplessness to depression and self-blame. Physical impacts include rape, suicide, and suicidal attempts. We found several examples of women and girls who were physically assaulted and even murdered as a result of their experience dealing with online harassment, often by family members who were ashamed by the online content and the subsequent reaction from internet users. Social impacts of tech-facilitated GBV are those that affect the victim's online and offline freedoms and expressions. Many of the examples of social impact that we noted in the literature were due to violent experiences that were sexual in nature, especially in intimate relationships. For example, in some instances where non-consensual intimate images were distributed and seen by family and community members, girls faced public exclusion, loss of social support, public humiliation, and restricted phone and internet usage. Economic, functional, and aspirational impacts include the disruptions to economic survival, daily life and career, and educational opportunities. For example, one survivor in India described being expelled from his family because of his experience of tech-facilitated GBV and had to, tech-facilitated GBV and was forced to support himself financially. A survivor in Sri Lanka was forced to move with her family and eventually flee the country. Other survivors reported being blackmailed for money or personal information. The literature also described how experiencing violence online could disrupt education and job opportunities. For example, some female journalists ended up leaving their profession completely to escape violence and harassment online. Moving on to the next slide, please. From the literature, we noted several challenges that impede response, mitigation, and prevention efforts. Most of these challenges are also seen globally, not just in Asia. First, as a result of these experiences, survivors tend to self-mediate or self-censor, minimize their online usage, and sometimes avoid usage altogether. This makes it difficult to support survivors, create a further gender digital divide online, and inhibit survivors from fully exercising their rights and freedoms in online spaces. Second, Western-based platforms such as Facebook are ill-equipped to deal with mediation and prevention efforts. For example, survivors said that some platforms do not allow violations to be reported in languages other than English. In many situations, survivors are told that their experiences of violence do not violate community standards and that their cases are not taken, and therefore their cases are not taken forward. There are few social, psychological, and functional support services and resources available for survivors. The ones that do exist are unfortunately underfunded, under-resourced, and underutilized. Family members are often unable to effectively provide support and prevent violence due to social stigma of abuse, or in cases of cyberbullying, it's due to lack of knowledge about internet and poor parent-child communication about risks of being online. Throughout all elements of society, including school, workplace, family unit, and government, there is a general lack of awareness and understanding of the issue, and therefore few resources are paid to try and prevent it. For example, in Vietnam, India, and Thailand, educators cited an inability to teach students about online safety, digital literacy, and risk of being online, often because there was no curricula covering these issues. Female journalists in India reported a lack of policies related to reporting of and response to online sexual harassment for employees. Finally, governments have instituted some policies and legal responses to address tech-facilitated GBV to varying levels of effectiveness. While policies protecting crimes against children and cyberbullying are more prevalent, governments are still struggling to create cohesive laws and timely policies that capture the increasing avenues of online GBV. Definitions of technology-facilitated GBV are also disjointed, outdated, or non-existent. Law enforcement officers often rely on or default to existing literature that further perpetuate patriarchal norms and protect perpetrators. For example, multiple countries have anti-obscenity or anti-pornography laws that are intended to protect social morality rather than the survivor. Laws revolving around public decency increase harm for marginalized communities such as LGBTQI+ individuals by labeling sexual expression online as criminal. We'd now like to turn to a few highlights from our 4 case study countries. Given that we do not have a lot of time for each, we aim to focus on the unique aspect of this issue in that country rather than discussing commonalities such as the fact that the prevalence of the issue has increased in all countries due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In India, moving on, in India, the most commonly reported form of tech-facilitated GBV are NCII, wrong number harassing phone calls, and a form of group harassment by cyber troops or troll armies, usually on social media platforms. Notable vulnerable groups include female journalists, politicians, activists, as well as marginalized groups such as LGBTQI+ communities. There are few legal frameworks for tech-facilitated GBV in India. The Information and Technology Act is most commonly used for legal recourse. And while law does address certain aspects, such as violations in privacy, it does not explicitly address psychological impacts of violence. Our KII experts in literature suggest that law enforcement approaches violence with the protectionist tendencies and focus on public morality and obscenity, disregarding the violence experienced by survivors. Survivors are often unable to name their experience as violence and are often victim blamed by law enforcement, all of which adversely impacts the effectiveness of the legal recourse. There are several key players in the programmatic space in India. Global and local NGOs and digital rights organizations are active in advocacy, research, and programmatic interventions related to reporting, monitoring, and addressing digital literacy gaps. Such NGOs include Association of Progressive Communications, Amnesty, Stoll Patrol, Center for Internet and Society, IT for Change, and Point of View, who have developed an online platform called Mera Dost, meaning my friend, that gives digital safety information via helplines to address cases of harassment experienced by women and girls, especially from low-income backgrounds. An app called My Amber, meaning My Sky, provides information and support for survivors of GBV, including online violence. It is a joint collaboration of NASCOM Foundation, Safety Trust, UN Women India, and Vodafone Idea Foundation. There are many funders of this issue in India, including Omidyar Network, Women's Fund Asia, and Mozilla Foundation. Open Tech Foundation also has been supporting initiatives on interrelated themes of technology and gender, digital rights, and digital safety in India. Moving on, in Indonesia, tech-facilitated GBV is increasing and referred to as online gender-based violence, or KGBO. The main form of violence discussed in the literature and in our KII was image-based abuse, especially the non-consensual dissemination of intimate images. For example, in 2020, 75% of the reported cases of online violence to the Indonesian National Commission on Violence Against Women were image-based abuse cases. Similar to what we found elsewhere, women, young people, and members of the LGBTQI community were most vulnerable. There are few laws and policies that protect victims against tech-facilitated GBV in Indonesia. In fact, legislation such as the anti-pornography law and electronic information and transaction laws have been used to criminalize victims of tech-facilitated GBV and or accommodate alleged offenders by giving them means to report victims for defamation. For years, GBV actors have been trying to pass a sexual violence bill, a comprehensive criminal justice response to the issue. However, setbacks such as reducing the number of acknowledged forms of sexual violence from 9 to 5 and concerns related to legitimization of LGBTQI+ behaviors have challenged the fate of the law. Programmatically, there are several key actors across civil society, the government, grassroots movements, which are pictured here. For example, SafeNet provides programs for survivors and conducts advocacy and research. They also have a hotline and website with materials for survivors. IPP has focused on programming. They have programming on digital security for LGBTQI+ individuals. Finally, the Legal Aid Foundation of the Indonesian Women's Association for Justice provides legal reform and support to survivors of GBV, including those experiencing tech-facilitated GBV. Over to you, Mithila.
Thank you, Pulumi. So I'll be continuing some of the case studies with Bangladesh and Thailand. So continuing with Bangladesh, cyber harassment is a key form of technology-facilitated GBV that we have found to be prevalent in Bangladesh, along with cyber stalking and image-based abuse. So as we've mentioned before, image-based abuse includes the creation of fake pornography referred to as deepfakes, as well as a recording of sexual assault, which has especially been a topic of national conversation due to recent incidents in Bangladesh. Women who are politically active online in Bangladesh experience degrading and humiliating comments online, including harassment. To understand such violence against women in the political sphere, it is important to recognize the larger political landscape in Bangladesh. While both the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition currently are women, government ministries, and particularly elected officials, are largely comprised of men. These gender dynamics feed into an overall patriarchal political environment that can transmit to the nature of public discourse surrounding politics in Bangladesh. LGBTQI+ members also face violence and marginalization, especially considering that there's legislation in effect in Bangladesh that is used against these individuals. In addition, the Hijra community are an identity category in Bangladesh for people who are assigned male at birth, who develop a feminine gender identity, and they have been ostracized and condemned by both cisgendered men and women in Bangladesh. The legal landscape in Bangladesh includes the Digital Security Act of 2018, which was initially put into place to address hate speech, but has been described as by many as draconian and used by the government to suppress dissent and target free speech. Other frameworks such as the ICT Act contain ambiguities that make it difficult to prosecute cases of cyber violence. However, it should be noted that in 2020, Bangladesh established an all-women police unit specifically to address cyber crimes against women. Feminist activist groups have also been vocal about technology-facilitated GBV, with national protests occurring recently. There are also organizations like BLAST that offer legal aid services as well as advocate for legal reform and training. BRAC has also been conducting awareness-raising campaigns to increase public knowledge on this issue. Next slide, please. In Thailand, key forms of technology-facilitated GBV include cyberbullying, image-based abuse, and defamation. Technology-facilitated GBV is often targeted towards female activists, singers, journalists, and others in the public eye. Cyberbullying is a form of harassment that is most frequently perpetrated amongst young people and students in Thailand, who we found mock and tease their peers on online platforms and social media sites, often as a result of offline disputes. Non-consensual intimate images and the sharing of these is also prevalent in school contexts in Thailand. In 2020, the police-led Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force rescued over 100 children from online sexual abuse, a figure that had doubled since statistics were first recorded in 2018. LGBTQI+ individuals are also targeted and mocked or misgendered online in Thailand. While there is legislation that is aimed at protecting Thai citizens from cyber attacks and misuse of cyber data, there is no specific legislation related to protecting individuals against cyber harassment, stalking, doxing, image-based abuse, or other forms of online violence. There are several key actors currently working to prevent and mitigate technology-facilitated gender-based violence in Thailand. Organizations such as FES Thailand and the Thai Netizen Network advocate for women's digital rights and conduct sensitization programs about women's rights and sexuality. The Foundation for Women also provides information, support, referral, and emergency assistance to women who have been victims of exploitation and violence. There's also engagement in Thailand from academics and student groups at Thai universities who conduct research on online violence as well as implement awareness campaigns. Student groups and advocates have collaborated with large international organizations such as UN Women to launch online initiatives such as the Girls Not Objects campaign, which counteracts objectification and online GBV. Next slide, please. So the next few slides will cover some of our recommendations based on our findings. Based on our findings, we have compiled some recommendations for actors in government, program implementers, and technology companies. So please note that these recommendations come from the evidence based in our literature review and key informant interviews. Many of these are not new to the field, but we continue to focus on them as they have either yet to be implemented or are poorly enforced. For governments, it is necessary to assess laws such as those related to anti-obscenity and anti-pornography that are actively harming survivors or restricting consensual sexual expressions. These laws are often used to reinforce patriarchal norms and do not support survivors or actively punish perpetrators, or instead are often used to target vulnerable populations. Instead, governments should introduce and enforce survivor-centric laws. Conducting a gender analysis of existing legislation will also help eliminate existing gaps and burdens that might be on survivors and whether existing laws represent the interests of survivors. We have also seen that standardized language and shared understanding of key terms and concepts related to technology-facilitated GBV remains an issue, especially as it relates to legal definitions of what behaviors constitute a reportable crime. Moving on to the next set, previous slide, please. For program implementers and researchers, awareness campaigns on digital safety and literacy are necessary. And this includes conducting public education campaigns on digital literacy, technology-facilitated GBV definitions, relevant laws, and available resources for those experiencing these forms of violence. This response should be diversified using both online and offline education tools to ensure accessibility and made broadly available to a wide range of groups, including netizens, government actors, and families. We've also seen the need to develop specialized training, especially for law enforcement and judicial actors, in order to understand applicable laws and how to support survivors. There's also a need for government agencies and NGOs to enhance data collection and reporting mechanisms, including accessible and anonymous reporting options to gain accurate data and to understand the depth and breadth of this issue. And finally, technology companies must take action to better protect users and respond to instances of technology-facilitated GBV. Privacy settings should be accessible and understandable to all users, including being user-friendly and in languages they can understand. Community standards should also be bolstered, including review and clearer communication of what is considered unacceptable content or behavior based on cultural relevance, local laws, and survivor needs. And finally, technology companies must build better capacity to ensure timely and appropriate responses when technology-facilitated GBV reports are made. Over to you, Laura. Next slide, please.
Sorry about that, everyone. I was having a hard time managing multiple screens and trying to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. Hopefully my camera is on. I can't really see myself. So anyway, yes, there I go. I see myself now. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you. I know we've been getting a lot of questions in the chat. And so let's go ahead and turn. Looks like we have pretty good time to answer some of those questions. So I might call on one of my colleagues who's been helping manage some of the question and answers to pull out some of the questions that have yet to be answered and read those out loud or paraphrase so that we can help figure out how to answer them.
Hey, Laura. One question, a theme that's been coming up a lot is about prevalence of TFGBV or tech facilitated GBV in conflict areas or countries that have weak political or judicial structures. It's a very interesting question and an area that we need to research more. I was wondering if that's something you can answer.
Yeah, unfortunately, really the conflict settings didn't come up in the literature. And again, I think that just means we don't have the documentation. Certainly we know this issue exists there, but I don't recall this issue, that context coming up in any of the peer review or gray literature that we reviewed from Asia. So I certainly think it's a gap in an area for further research. Our scope for this project was very broad, just really focused on experiences of this issue in the region more broadly. I think a deep dive needs to be done on that topic. So not sure we personally have much to share on that, but appreciate the comment.
Thanks, Laura. The other question we have, which again is very interesting, is basically asking us if we can provide some good examples of private-public partnerships with police that are working to address this issue, maybe examples of MOUs between NGOs, tech companies, and the police I can start very briefly by saying this is something that Mitla covered in the recommendations. We definitely want these stakeholders who are key actors to work collaboratively so that we can really address this issue in a targeted way. Some ways that they can work together is just if NGOs can organize awareness campaigns or training sessions, sensitization workshops for law enforcement, first responders, police, to better understand what this behavior, what is this form of violence, how they can respond, how they can provide support to survivors, and basically improve reporting mechanisms. Over to you, Laura, to add maybe a little bit about tech companies.
Yeah, thanks for kicking that off. I don't have like very specific examples, but I do know across the case studies this came up. I was working specifically on the Indonesia case study, and definitely there were many examples of local NGOs working with police, really trying to bolster their training on the topic, what it is, how to address it, how to understand the laws, how to understand how to support victims who are going through the system. So I was really impressed by the level of collaboration in Indonesia between government, NGO, grassroots movement, police, and the legal system. So I really think these things are starting to come together. I know that resources are an issue. A lot of these organizations don't have a lot of funding, but I think that that's changing. I really think that as this issue is becoming more important and more recognized and visible, that sort of not only is the international community and who are able to provide support, Amnesty International, UN, USAID, all these sort of organizations putting more attention and resources towards the issue, but also local governments as well are starting to understand the importance of getting ahead of this issue. So tech companies, yes. So again, the example I have from Indonesia is one of the main players that works there with people who are experiencing this issue, has a direct line to the tech company and tries to provide feedback from the victims and survivors that they talk about and learn about through their own reporting mechanisms. They provide that feedback back to the certain platforms. I don't remember specifically which ones, whether it's Facebook or WhatsApp, but we do know, as we talked about in the presentation, there are a lot of inherent challenges with the reporting mechanisms with the tech companies. So I think it's still just an ongoing conversation.
Thanks, Laura. Some more questions coming in the chat. One theme on questions is focused on prosecution and how easy or difficult it is to prosecute perpetrators. So there's a question about what are the, specifically in Indonesia and Bangladesh, cyber harassment and GBV are complicated and are quite difficult to prosecute those crimes or for victims to even gather proof. Are there specific institutions who are key actors on the field that can give assistance to victims such that their experience is recognized by the administration or law enforcement or those who are the key decision makers?
Yeah, again, that was a very common theme that we found in our key informant interviews, definitely in Indonesia, and I'll let others speak about the other countries. The laws are insufficient, they are complicated, and in many cases, certain laws actually tend to support the perpetrators rather than the victims. And so there's a lot of work needing to be done to enhance the laws. And again, I think this is such a complicated and in some respects a new issue. And so people are just trying to figure out how can they use existing laws to better support victims? How can they create new laws to better support victims and survivors and also punish perpetrators? Because I think we've seen a lot of cases where cases are just not able to be moved through the system. They have to be thrown out or not using the legal mechanisms to make those cases happen. So I'm wondering perhaps if someone from the Bangladesh case study team wants to speak about something more specific and or Connor about Indonesia.
Hi, Laura. Just to speak a little bit about Bangladesh and what we learned about the legal landscape is that Another issue is that there often seem to be existing frameworks in place. I know in Bangladesh, especially now, they are ramping up efforts in cybercrime units and the like, but it's also an issue of resources to legal actors to really know how to effectively implement existing frameworks, and as well as looking at whether, the frameworks truly address the survivor and victim concerns.
Thanks, Mayumi. I can maybe share another set of questions that are centered around monitoring and reporting mechanisms. So one question says, I'm curious if you saw surveillance, spyware, monitoring tech use. I didn't see it in the framework, but I might have missed it. In my nonprofit work, it was a common form of domestic violence used by abusive partners to maintain power and control. I can quickly start with responding to that and turn it over to you, Laura. That is something that we that came up in our literature and also through our key informant interviews, especially in countries that have a patriarchal culture where this is a way of asserting male dominance, and in countries where family honor, especially in Pakistan, is very important in the culture. So you have brothers monitoring, their sisters' cell phones, or husbands monitoring wives' online activity, who they're chatting with, their phones. So that is something that came up consistently in the literature and through key informant interviews.
Yeah, thanks, Betty. Not too much to add. It's certainly an important part of this, and certainly why we sort of focus on the tech facilitated versus online, because we know that there's other ways that technology can be used to facilitate this violence, and I think that's a really great example.
One more question is about, it says, I want to know the responses that the organization recorded from social media companies such as Facebook on this kind of cyber-based sexual harassment. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly, but what I'm reading is that you're asking us if we got responses from tech companies directly on this form of violence. And if that's correct, that is not something that we got, because we did not interview any tech companies directly as part of the study. This study that we are publishing is really just scratching the surface of the issue. There's just so much to unearth and so many stakeholders that we need to speak with. But that is something that we hope to do in the future, and it's not something that we have included in our current study. Anything to add, Laura?
Yeah, no, it was beyond the scope of this study. I know in some previous work that we did on this topic a few years ago, when we were developing the conceptual framework that you saw early in the presentation, we tried very, very, very hard to talk to different tech companies. We even actually had a scheduled meeting with Facebook that kept getting moved and then finally canceled. We don't quite know why. I think maybe they were nervous to talk to us, or maybe they thought we were too small beings to talk to. I'm not exactly sure. But I think they're also just big companies dealing with a lot of different things. And so we've had good conversations with Google and other tech companies along the way. I think there's a lot of very, very dedicated people internal that really want to work on this issue, that really care about this issue. It's just going to take time, I think, for this evolving issue for them to know how to deal with. I mean, a lot of the challenges we saw in Asia are some of them are simple fixes. I mean, there's language issues. There's just privacy, the way they talk about privacy with new users and how to opt in and opt out. There's different things that I think are easier lifts, but there's a lot of complicated things as well. I know one of the challenges that I think it was in Indonesia was that because of COVID, a lot of the reports getting flagged to the tech companies, unless they were about COVID specific things, they were sort of deprioritized. So there's just a lot going on, and I think it's going to take a while, but I do think the tech companies want to be open, but there's a lot of inherent challenges too.
Thanks, Laura. Another question, and it's really difficult. I don't really know how to answer that, but it's basically about the feasibility of some of our recommendations. So it says, in order to implement them, given the pandemic has further minimized civil society spaces, authoritarian governments are on the rise, feminist and human rights defenders are under attack. What is the feasibility of some of these recommendations? And therefore, are there some recommendations that can be advocated as more feasible than others? And of course, these can be different from one country to another, given and even within the same country.
Yeah, that is a very challenging question to answer. I mean, but that's, you know, that's a good question. I certainly don't know that I could answer it either. I will just say, I was really impressed, and I think I keep coming back to this, with the number of different groups who care about this issue in these countries, who are fighting on this issue, and the diversity of those groups. So again, seeing LGBTQI plus organizations that are working on this issue, traditional gender-based violence organizations working on this issue, grassroots movements and people who are celebrities or tech stars or whatever, who have been personally affected by this, who are taking the microphone, going out in the streets. I've seen, you know, internal to government, certain particular actors who, again, are really trying to push for a change. I just think it's one of those things that's going to take time, but the collaboration, and if there are ways that we can, as a donor community or as, you know, researchers, as implementers, foster that collaboration so that these different actors are able to work together to pass new legislation, to get resources for trainings, really helping on them build the literacy of populations to understand what consent means, all these different things. I think if we just continue with collaboration and pushing some of these efforts, that we'll slowly get there. I think we're almost at time, but maybe if there's one more question.
I was gonna say, there is a question of, it says, wondering if you found any particularly unique or innovative programming responses to address TFGBV that seemed promising, but perhaps thus far underfunded, undertested.
Someone from my team? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't specifically look at interventions and evaluations of interventions to see what's worked, whether or not it was innovative, what about it didn't work. Again, it's something that we are very much happy to explore further. We are also, our research was limited in scope in terms of the region, in terms of certain countries. Our findings are not reflective of anything from Africa or Latin America, but it's something that we would like to explore.
Yeah, and just to add that there aren't a lot of formal evaluations of any of the programs that are existing. So I think we're just hesitant to say, like, this program we know works. That being said, I mean, there's just a lot of different types of programs out there. Just ones that I personally found very intriguing. Some which are, you know, more Western based, but work in Asia, like Heart Mob, just different organizations that take campaigns and make them localized in certain communities, or that offer online support to victims, people who are currently experiencing them, helping them know what to do. Like, don't immediately shut down your account when something happens. You need documentation and proof. So I was really, you know, again, I'm encouraged by the number of different types of programs out there. They're all very small. There's not a lot of large scale programming going on yet, just little programs here and there. But I think there's a lot of innovative ways that people are trying to address the issue. So thanks for the question. So yeah, it looks like we're at time. So thanks everyone so much for joining. Look for our report coming out in February 2022. And yeah, thanks for all your engaging questions, and wish we had more time to talk, but thanks also to USAID for funding this really important project, and to the entire team here at NORC and ICRW. So thanks everyone.